Hello, my dear wanderers. It's Soren. Welcome back. Tonight we journey to Bali, where quiet temples rise among rice terraces and banyan trees. Their gates open like pages in a book, and incense drifts into the sea breeze. The air is soft with the mingling of salt and smoke, and the sound of roosters and gamelan lingers like threads of music in the morning light. These temples do not shout their presence, but breathe with the island, stone and wood shaped to hold both silence and ritual. So, before you drift into sleep, take a moment to like and subscribe, only if this brought you calm. Tell me where you're listening from, and what time it is for you. Now, dim the lights, take a deep breath, and let's drift into tonight's journey together. In the heart of Bali, where volcanic slopes fall into green valleys, and the air carries both the scent of incense and the salt of the sea, stand temples that are as much a part of the landscape as the rice terraces and banyan trees. They are not monuments in the way of European cathedrals, built to impress with soaring height and vast stone interiors. Instead, Balinese temples seem to grow out of the ground, their gates and shrines blending with jungle vines and volcanic rock, as though the island itself is offering them up. To walk among them is to feel not awe in the sense of grandeur, but quietude in the sense of belonging. They are places where human hands carved stone but left room for wind, water, and silence to linger. These temples, known as pura, dot the island in remarkable numbers. Some are vast complexes that draw crowds of pilgrims and visitors, like Berserkers, the so-called Mother Temple on the slopes of Mount Agung. Others are small family shrines tucked into courtyards, their incense smoke curling into the morning air as roosters crow. Together, they form a spiritual web across the island, connecting mountain to sea, home to cosmos, daily life to eternal rhythm. To understand Bali's temples is to understand a culture that does not separate the sacred from the ordinary, but threads them together like flowers on a garland. The structure of a Balinese temple is both simple and layered. Each pura is an open-air complex of courtyards, entered through a gate that resembles a mountain split in two. These split gates, or Kande Bantar, symbolize the passage between the ordinary world and the sacred. Inside, the courtyards lead deeper toward inner sanctuaries, with shrines, towers, and pavilions arranged according to cosmic principles. Roofs are often layered tiers of palm fiber, black against the sky, stacked like steps of a stairway to the heavens. The materials are humble: wood, stone, straw, yet arranged with such precision that the effect is more timeless than luxurious. The setting of these temples is as important as their architecture. Balinese spiritual life is rooted in the idea of harmony between humans, nature, and the divine, a principle called Trihita Karana. Mountains are seen as sacred abodes of gods, rivers as lifelines, and the sea as both giver and taker. Temples rise in alignment with these forces. Mountain temples face the high peaks, sea temples guard the coast, village temples anchor communities, and household shrines tie families to the same cosmic order. Each setting is chosen not by chance, but by careful understanding of the island's spiritual geography. The rituals within these temples are not grand theatrical performances, but rhythmic, steady cycles of offerings, prayers, and ceremonies. Daily offerings called kanangasari, small palm leaf baskets filled with flowers, rice, and incense, are placed not only on temple altars, but also on thresholds, vehicles, and even sidewalks. The offering itself is simple, yet its repetition weaves sacredness into every corner of life. Festivals bring larger gatherings with gamelan music, dancing, and processions. But even these remain connected to cycles of rice planting, harvest, and lunar calendars. Religion in Bali is less about occasional spectacle and more about the constant rhythm of presence. The silence of Bali's temples is not always literal silence. Roosters may crow nearby, children may play in courtyards, and gamelan musicians may rehearse for a festival. Yet beneath all that, a deeper stillness is felt. It is the stillness of continuity, of knowing that these rituals have been carried out for centuries, through kingdoms, colonization, and modern tourism. The world has changed, but the incense still rises each morning. The shrines still receive their offerings, the gates still open into courtyards, where balance is remembered. Berserkers temple exemplifies this continuity. Perched nearly 1,000 meters up Mount Agung, it consists of more than 80 individual temples, each with its own shrines and courtyards. Yet together forming a single sacred complex, pilgrims ascend its stone steps, passing through layers of gates and courtyards. Moving upward both physically and spiritually, the mountain itself, often wreathed in clouds, frames the entire experience. For Balinese worshippers, this ascent is not just toward a temple, but toward the presence of gods dwelling on the mountain. For visitors, it feels less like entering a building, and more like entering a landscape where every stone and tree participates in ritual. Other temples carry different moods. Tanalot, perched on a rock out at sea, is battered by waves and surrounded by water at high tide, as though reminding worshippers of the fragility of human presence beside the ocean's vastness. Uluwatu, set on a high cliff above the southern sea, offers dizzying views of horizon and surf, its shrines clinging to the edge between sky and water. Goa Gaja, or the Elephant Cave, opens with a carved demon mouth, leading not into horror but into a quiet meditation chamber and bathing pools. Each site, whether grand or modest, carries its own whisper of sacred geography, its own invitation to pause. Temples are not museums, though tourists often treat them that way. They are living spaces, continually maintained, decorated, and enlivened by ritual. Their stone carvings may be centuries old, but their shrines are refreshed with daily offerings. Priests still chant, dancers still perform in festivals, villagers still gather in their courtyards. This living quality makes them different from many ancient ruins elsewhere. In Bali, history and present blur. A ceremony performed today looks much like one performed centuries ago, the only difference being the occasional smartphone photographing it. The quiet of Bali's temples is also a lesson in scale. They do not dominate with size, but invite with detail. A carved guardian statue at a gate, moss growing in its creases, a woven palm leaf offering, delicate and temporary, resting on a stone altar, the sound of bamboo gamelan instruments floating from a pavilion. These details gather into an atmosphere that is not overwhelming, but absorbing, like a slow tide of stillness. One does not feel forced to bow, but drawn to linger. And so, as incense drifts upward through temple courtyards, mingling with mountain air or sea spray, the impression grows that Bali's temples are not separate from the island, but integral to its rhythm. They are quiet temples, not because they are empty or hushed, but because they cultivate a quiet of the spirit, a peace found not in withdrawal from the world, but in harmony with it. Flowing deeper into the story of Bali's temples, the rituals that fill them appear less like interruptions of daily life and more like its heartbeat. To live in Bali is to live within cycles of rice planting and harvest, of moon phases, of festivals that return year after year with the inevitability of sunrise. These rhythms shape not only the agricultural calendar, but also the religious one, and in the courtyards of the temples, the two merge seamlessly. Every morning, women prepare kanangasari, the small offerings woven from palm leaves. These are filled with flowers, rice, and sometimes coins, and they are sprinkled with a few drops of holy water before being placed on shrines, doorsteps, and pathways. To an outsider, they might seem like simple decorations, but to a Balinese family, they are the daily act of maintaining balance between the human, the natural, and the divine. The sight of these offerings, bright with flowers scattered across streets and temple courtyards, gives Bali its distinctive sense of continuous devotion. Each basket will be stepped over, blown by wind, washed by rain, but always replaced again the next morning. The larger ceremonies expand this same rhythm into communal scale. Village temples, known as Pura Dese, host festivals tied to the lunar calendar, where processions carry effigies of deities through decorated gates. Gamelan orchestras fill the air with shimmering tones. Dancers in ornate costumes move with deliberate grace, and incense clouds drift in thick layers. These festivals are not rare spectacles, but regular events. Each village has its own schedule, meaning that across the island, somewhere at any moment, a temple is alive with music, dance, and prayer. The layout of the temples themselves reflects these rhythms. Courtyards are arranged in 3 zones, corresponding to different levels of sacredness. The outer courtyard, Jaba Pazan, is open and often used for preparations. Middle courtyard, Jaba Tunga, hosts pavilions for gamelan and community gatherings. The innermost courtyard, Jeron, is the most sacred, housing shrines and towers where the presence of gods is invited. Movement through these courtyards during a ceremony mirrors the movement from ordinary to sacred, from preparation to communion. It is a gradual deepening, not unlike walking slowly from the noise of a street into the stillness of a garden. At the heart of many rituals is water, considered the carrier of divine energy. Holy water, Turta, is sprinkled over worshippers, poured into vessels, and even carried back to homes for blessings. Temples often include pools or fountains, fed by springs regarded as sacred. Turta, in Pool, near Ubud, is one such water temple, famous for its long pools where pilgrims step into cool water to undergo purification. The sound of water running through stone spouts becomes part of the temple's music, a constant reminder that cleansing and renewal are as essential as prayer. The role of priests, or pimanku, is to guide these rituals, but the responsibility for offerings and preparation rests with the community. There is no division between professional clergy and passive congregants. Instead, religion is woven into the fabric of village life. Families take turns preparing decorations, weaving palm leaf ornaments, cooking food for feasts, and rehearsing music and dance. The temple is not simply a sacred site. It is a communal stage, and every villager has a part in the performance. This communal aspect creates a subtle sense of balance between solemnity and joy. A festival may include sacred dances and prayers, but it also includes shared meals, laughter, and even a marketplace atmosphere outside the gates. The sacred and the social are not opposed, but intertwined. One can walk from a courtyard filled with incense and chanting to a nearby stall selling roasted peanuts and sweets. The transition feels natural, a reminder that spirituality here does not demand withdrawal from life, but immersion in it. The geography of Bali's temples reinforces this rhythm of balance. Every village has at least 3, the Pura Posa, dedicated to the ancestors and located toward the mountains, the Pura Desert, the village center, and the Pura Dalem, associated with death and often located near the sea or a river. This triad ensures that the village is spiritually balanced between past, present, and future, between creation and dissolution. Walking between these temples is itself a ritual, a movement across the cycle of life mirrored in the landscape. Even the smallest details of temple life reveal layers of meaning. Carved guardian statues at entrances, often wrapped in black and white checkered cloth, represent the balance of opposites, good and evil, light and shadow, kept in harmony. Bamboo poles called penjor, curved and decorated with woven ornaments, line pathways during festivals, symbolizing fertility and prosperity. Each object is temporary, made of natural materials that will decay only to be remade again. This constant renewal ensures that the sacred remains alive, not preserved like a relic, but recreated like a song that must be sung daily. Visitors often remark on the sensory richness of Balinese temples. The color of flowers, the smell of incense, the shimmer of gamelan, the feel of holy water on the forehead. Yet beneath the sensory abundance lies a deeper stillness, a rhythm that soothes rather than overwhelms. The ceremonies do not aim to dazzle, but to align, to bring human life into balance with the rhythms of nature and the cosmos. Thus, the pathways of ritual in Bali's temples are not narrow tracks leading only to the divine. They are broad cycles that include family, village, landscape, and gods in a single flow. The quiet peace of these temples lies not in their isolation, but in their integration, in the way daily life itself becomes an offering. Moving outward from the village shrines and family courtyards, the landscape of Bali reveals its wider map of sacred sites, stretched between high volcanic peaks and the restless line of the ocean. The island's geography is not merely background, but a living framework for its temple. Mountains are revered as the dwelling places of gods, while the sea represents both danger and purification. Between these two poles, temples rise to mark the balance, forming a spiritual geography that is as important as rice fields and rivers. The most imposing of these sites is Pura Besaki, often called the Mother Temple of Bali, located high on the slopes of Mount Agung, the island's tallest and most sacred volcano. It is not a single temple, but a sprawling complex of more than 80 shrines and pavilions. Approaching Besaki feels less like entering a building and more like ascending into a mountain village made of stone and prayer. Flights of steps lead through gate after gate, each courtyard opening to new shrines with tiered roofs that climb into the mist. Clouds often drift across its courtyards, wrapping pilgrims in shifting veils of air. To worship here is to feel suspended between earth and sky, the presence of the volcano towering silently above as both protector and reminder of fragility. Sea temples, by contrast, are positioned at the edges of the island, where waves crash endlessly against stone. Perhaps the most famous is Tanah Lot, perched on a rocky outcrop that becomes an island at high tide. Surrounded by water, its shrines seem caught in perpetual negotiation with the sea, resisting its force yet shaped by it. Visitors come to watch the sunset here, but for worshippers the experience is older and quieter. The sea's roar as a hymn, the horizon as altar, the temple as guardian against the unseen. Farther south, Uluwatu Temple clings to the edge of a cliff, hundreds of feet above the Indian Ocean. From its courtyards, one can see the expanse of sea stretching unbroken, waves rolling far below like a breathing present. Monkeys dart across walls, guardians of a mischievous sort, as priests prepare offerings in small shrines shaded by banyan trees. In the evenings, the temple hosts cakek performances chanting fire and dance that draw visitors, blending ritual with theater in a way that keeps the temple alive as both sacred space and cultural gathering. Other coastal temples form part of a symbolic chain. Legend speaks of a series of sea temples built by a 16th century priest, each within sight of the next, encircling Bali like a protective ring. Choi Luhur Batu Kara, on the western slopes of another mountain, represents balance from the inland side, its courtyards quiet and moss-covered, surrounded by rainforest mist. Together, these mountain and sea temples mark the boundaries of the island's sacred geography, like pillars holding up an invisible dome. The positioning of temples reflects the Balinese concept of Kaja and Kelud, toward the mountains and toward the sea. Mountains, to the north and center, are associated with purity, gods, and ancestors. The sea, to the south, carries associations of dissolution and danger, but also cleansing and renewal. Villages orient their temples according to this polarity, with shrines for ancestors toward the mountain and shrines for death and purification toward the sea. Thus, even a small village participates in the same cosmic alignment as the grandest temple. The natural settings of these temples are inseparable from their atmosphere. At Berserkers, mist and silence dominate, interrupted only by bells and chants. At Tanalot, the salt spray and crashing surf are constant companions. At Uluwatu, the wind sweeps across cliffs, carrying both incense smoke and the cries of seabirds. Each temple feels less like a human construction imposed on nature and more like a frame through which nature itself becomes sacred. Stone courtyards open to sky, gates reveal mountains, shrines face water. The architecture is always in dialogue with the land and sea around it. Ceremonies at these sites often involve processions from villages, with offerings carried in tall, colorful towers balanced on the heads of women. Gamelan music and chanting accompany the journey, turning the act of travel itself into ritual. Arriving at a mountain or sea temple is not simply about reaching a destination, but about carrying the village into alignment with larger forces, the volcano, the ocean, the horizon. These pilgrimages stitch communities into the broader fabric of the island's sacred geography, ensuring that no temple is isolated, but always part of a living network. For modern visitors, the beauty of these settings often overwhelms the quiet details of ritual. Tourists crowd the cliffs of Uluwatu for sunset photographs, or the rock paths to Tanalot for the perfect view. Yet, beneath the spectacle, the deeper rhythm continues. Local families still come with baskets of offerings. Priests still sprinkle holy water, and the sound of prayer still weaves into the roar of surf or rustle of wind. The temples do not reject attention, they simply absorb it, continuing their cycles regardless of who watches. Drifting through mountain mist or sea spray, one senses that these temples are not primarily about grandeur, but about placement. They exist where land meets sky, where land meets water, where human life meets the forces beyond its control. They remind worshippers and visitors alike that peace is found not by escaping these forces, but by standing in balance with them. In Bali's quiet temples of mountain and sea, geography itself becomes the sermon, whispered by stone, cloud, and tide. Moving inward again, away from cliffs and volcanoes, the quieter details of Balinese temples begin to reveal themselves. They are not vast spaces demanding awe, but layered courtyards where every surface is touched by human hands and natural growth. Walls and gates are carved with patterns that seem endless. Floral swirls, guardian figures with bulging eyes, mythical beasts mid-snarl, Over time, moss creeps into the creases, softening the ferocity, making each figure look as though it has grown naturally from the stone. The carvings are not meant to intimidate, but to remind, marking the thresholds where human space shifts toward the sacred. At entrances stand Divrapala, the guardian statues often dressed in black and white checkered cloth called paleng. The cloth itself embodies balance, black and white, good and evil, order and chaos, woven together rather than opposed. Villagers replace these cloths regularly, tying knots with casual familiarity. The act is not ceremonial theatre for outsiders, but simple maintenance of harmony, as natural as sweeping a courtyard or refilling an offering. Offerings themselves dominate the texture of temple life. The Kanan sari, small palm leaf trays filled with flowers, rice, and sometimes incense, are everywhere. A red flower pointing east, a white flower pointing west, a green leaf for balance. Each element is placed with care, even if the arrangement will last only a few hours before wind scatters it. Larger ceremonies bring more elaborate offerings, towers of fruit and cakes arranged into pyramids, carried on the heads of women in slow, steady procession. The effect is both practical and poetic. Food and flowers given away as gifts, reminders that sustenance itself belongs first to the gods. The ephemeral nature of offerings gives Balinese ritual a rhythm of constant renewal. Unlike stone temples that stand for centuries, offerings decay daily. The act of making and remaking them becomes the devotion, more than the objects themselves. To an outsider, the sight of scattered, trampled offerings on streets may look careless. To a Balinese family, it is the natural end of a gift that was never meant to last. Tomorrow, a new one will take its place. Within temple courtyards, pavilions with open sides and high thatched roofs provide space for music, dance, and community gatherings. These are not permanent sanctuaries, but flexible stages, used as needed. During festivals, they fill with the shimmering sound of gamelan orchestras, whose overlapping tones seem designed to mimic the hum of insects, the rustle of wind through bamboo, the rhythm of water in rice fields. In quieter times, the same pavilions may host meetings, meals, or rehearsals, serving as extensions of village life. The shrines themselves are often small, raised platforms with tiered roofs. These Murray towers, with their black palm fiber tiers, can have anywhere from 3 to 11 layers, always in odd numbers. Each layer represents a level of the cosmos, with the tallest towers dedicated to the most revered deities. To stand before a Meru is to look not at a building, but at a model of the universe, compressed into layered roofs that climb toward the sky. Incense drifts upward from the base, carrying prayers to join the symbolic ascent. Priests move through these spaces with a calm rhythm, their rituals steady rather than dramatic. They sprinkle holy water, ring small bells, and chant softly, their voices mingling with the sound of gamelan or the crowing of roosters from nearby courtyards. Villagers kneel in rows, holding flowers between fingers, then touch them to their foreheads as the priest's bell punctuates the silence. It is a ceremony that feels less like a performance and more like breathing, necessary, regular, unhurried. The artistry of temple life extends beyond carvings and offerings into textiles, music, and dance. Costumes for ritual dances are stored within temple pavilions, richly decorated with gold thread and mirrors that catch candlelight. Dancers embody mythological figures, their gestures slow and precise, each movement codified through generations. These performances are not entertainment in the modern sense, but part of the ritual itself, a way of making stories present before the gods. Even the air of the temple, feels composed of layers. The scent of incense blends with frangipani blossoms scattered on the ground. The cool dampness of stone steps contrasts with the warmth of sunlit courtyards. Sounds drift between shrines, bells, drums, children's laughter, the cooing of doves roosting in rafters. The sacred here is not set apart from these sensory details. It is made through them, as though holiness emerges not from separation, but from weaving together all the elements of daily life. For the Balinese, the temple is not a place visited only on holy days, but a constant presence. Families tend their own household shrines, villages maintain their communal temples, and larger pilgrimages connect them to the great mountain and sea shrine. This layered system ensures that spirituality flows from the most intimate corner of a home to the most expansive peak of the island. Each level mirrors the others, so that placing a flower on a small altar in a courtyard participates in the same cosmic balance as a procession. At Berserkers, in the quiet rhythm of these details, carvings softened by moss, offerings renewed daily, incense curling upward, the temples of Bali reveal their true power. They are not grand statements frozen in stone, but living environments, renewed constantly through small acts of devotion. Their peace lies not in being untouched by time, but in accepting time's passing and meeting it with flowers, cloth, and steady ritual. Drifting further into the story of Bali's temples, one finds that they are not only places of quiet offering, but also destinations for movement, pilgrimages that thread across the island, carrying people, music, and offerings from one sacred site to another. The Balinese sense of spirituality is not static. It is a rhythm of walking, carrying, and processing, with temples acting as both anchor points and way stations. Pilgrimages often begin at the household level. A family may prepare offerings days in advance, weaving palm leaf baskets, arranging fruit towers, or sewing new cloths for shrines. On the appointed day, family members dress in ceremonial attire, men in white shirts and sashes, women in lace blouses and batik sarongs, all crowned with neat headcloths. Baskets of offerings are balanced on the heads of women, while men carry ceremonial umbrellas, drums, or banners. The journey begins not with grandeur, but with steady steps out of the courtyard, into the village road, and onward toward the temple. As families converge, the procession grows. Villagers gather behind gamelan musicians who strike bronze keys and gongs, creating music that ripples forward like water. Priests walk in the center, carrying vessels of holy water or effigies of deities wrapped in white and gold cloth. Children join with laughter, chickens scatter from the roadside, and neighbors pause their work to watch. The procession becomes both sacred act and communal display, a slow-moving river of sound and color flowing toward the temple gates. At larger festivals, these processions can stretch for miles. Pilgrims ascend steep paths to mountain temples like Berserkers, stopping at smaller shrines along the way to leave offerings. At sea temples such as Tanalot or Uluwatu, the processions move across beaches and cliff paths, the sea itself forming part of the ritual backdrop. Each step is both literal and symbolic, a physical climb toward a shrine and a spiritual ascent toward harmony with the divine. The arrival at the temple is marked by the passing through gates. First, the split Kandi Bentar, then deeper gateways that resemble roofed towers, finally into the innermost courtyards. Each threshold crossed is a layer shed, moving from the everyday world into the sacred core. Priests ring bells, incense thickens, and the offerings are arranged on altars, their colors bright against the dark volcanic stone. The fruit towers, sometimes taller than the women carrying them, are placed with careful balance, a visual reminder that abundance itself must be steadied by devotion. Rituals follow a cycle of purification, prayer, and blessing. Priests sprinkle holy water over the gathered crowd, who press flowers between their fingers, lift them to their foreheads, and then tuck them behind their ears. The sound of the bell punctuates the silence, marking the rhythm of prayer. Between chants, gamelan music drifts, mingling with the rustle of wind and the occasional crow of a rooster from outside the walls. It is a blend of solemnity and ordinariness, as if the divine is not apart from daily life, but woven into it. After the prayers, food is shared. Pilgrims unwrap packets of rice and vegetables, carried from home, eating together in temple courtyards. Children run among the shrines, laughter mixing with the scent of incense. Vendors often set up outside the temple gates, selling sweets, satay, or drinks, turning the pilgrimage into both a spiritual and social gathering. In this way, the act of worship extends naturally into celebration, reminding everyone that community is as sacred as the shrine. Pilgrimages are not always confined to a single temple. Some rituals require visiting multiple sites, tracing a path across the island's sacred geography. A village may journey to its ancestral mountain temple, then onward to a sea temple, completing a cycle of balance between Kaja, mountainward, and Kalod, seaward. These journeys can last days, linking villages into networks of shared devotion. The island itself becomes a temple, with its rivers, rice terraces, and coastlines serving as corridors of ritual. For those who live outside Bali, such processions may seem elaborate or theatrical. Yet for Balinese villagers, they are part of the ordinary flow of life. The effort of walking miles in heat, carrying heavy offerings, is not seen as burden but as participation in a cycle larger than oneself. To join the procession is to join the heartbeat of the community and the island. The visual impression of these pilgrimages lingers in memory. Rows of white and gold-clad figures climbing mountain steps, fruit towers balanced impossibly high, umbrellas bobbing like floating suns, gamelan rhythms carrying the crowd forward. Yet beneath the spectacle lies quiet purpose. Each step is an offering, each flower a prayer, each meal shared a reminder that devotion is sustained, not by isolation but by movement together. The peace of Bali's temples is not only found in the stillness of courtyards, but also in the flow of people toward them, carrying their gifts, their music, and their laughter. Pilgrimage and procession turn the island itself into a path of devotion, where every road can lead to sacredness if walked with care. Flowing onward from the steady rhythm of pilgrimage, the temples of Bali reveal another layer of devotion. Dance. If offerings are the language of flowers and food, and processions the language of movement through landscape, then dance is the language of the body itself, shaped into stories for both gods and humans. Within temple courtyards, beneath the shade of pavilions, or in the open air of festival nights, dancers transform myth into motion, their steps and gestures as much a prayer as the incense curling upward. Dance in Bali is inseparable from ritual. Each performance is an offering, a way of embodying the epics and legends that form the island's spiritual heritage. The Ramayana and Mahabharata, ancient Indian stories absorbed into Balinese culture, are retold through stylized movement. Characters of gods, demons, and heroes are made visible in the precise tilt of a head, the flick of a hand, the stamp of a foot. The temple becomes not just a space of worship, but a stage where myths live again, each performance renewing the connection between community, story, and divine presence. The movements are deliberate, almost meditative in their detail. Eyes dart sharply to the side, fingers curl and unfold with exact precision, shoulders quiver in delicate tremors. A single gesture may signify an entire thought or emotion. To learn these movements is to memorize a vocabulary of devotion, passed from teacher to student across generations. Children begin training young, repeating gestures until muscle memory carries them as naturally as breathing. By the time they perform in temple ceremonies, their bodies have become fluent in the stories of God. Costumes heighten the effect. Golden headdresses rise high above dancers' faces, shimmering in torchlight. Brocaded cloth wraps around waists and flows in layered skirts. Mirrors and sequins catch the flicker of candles, turning each gesture into a burst of reflected light. Dancers playing gods move with controlled grace, while those embodying demons twist into sharp angles, their faces masked in fearsome expressions. The contrast is deliberate, balance played out in fabric and form, reminding spectators that harmony includes both light and shadow. The gamelan orchestra underpins it all. Bronze gongs and the telephones create a sound that is less melody than texture. Layers of rhythm and tone overlapping in ways that feel both chaotic and ordered. The music mirrors the unpredictability of life, shimmering like sunlight on water, but it always resolves into balance. Dancers and musicians are inseparable. Each movement responds to a beat. Each beat anticipates a step. To witness the two together is to sense that the temple itself is breathing, stone and wood vibrating with rhythm. Not every temple dance is narrative. Some are purely devotional, like the pendit, a welcoming dance where young women carry offerings of flowers, scattering petals before shrines. The gestures are gentle, the atmosphere serene, as though the dancers are not performing for an audience, but greeting the gods themselves. Other dances, like the Berserkers, embody the spirit of warriors, their movements sharp and martial, an offering of strength. Each style of dance serves its purpose, whether to tell, to invite, to honor, or to protect. Perhaps the most famous ritual performance is the crackle, often staged at Uluwatu Temple's cliffs. Unlike gamelan-driven dances, crackle is accompanied by a chorus of men chanting cake in interlocking rhythms, their voices rising and falling like waves. They sit in concentric circles, swaying and chanting as dancers move in the center, retelling the Ramayana with firelight flickering around them. The effect is hypnotic, a merging of human voices into a single tide of sound, echoing the roar of the sea below. Though now performed for visitors, its roots remain in trance rituals, where chant and movement blur the line between human and divine. Trance itself plays an important role in temple dances. In certain ceremonies, dancers enter states believed to invite possession by gods or spirits. They may walk across burning coals, pierce themselves without apparent harm, or move with strength beyond their ordinary capacity. For the community, these acts are not spectacles, but confirmations that the divine has accepted their offering. The temple becomes a threshold where human bodies serve as vessels, bridging mortal and immortal worlds. For outsiders, temple dances can appear like elaborate theater, but for Balinese communities, they are living acts of worship. The audience includes not only villagers and tourists, but also the gods, invited through offerings and chants to witness the performance. Every step, every hizajit, every note of music is directed upward as much as outward. The dancers are not performers in the modern sense, but participants in a cycle of giving, where beauty itself becomes offering. In the quiet after a festival, when costumes are folded away and instruments rest silent in pavilions, the temple seems to breathe more slowly, as if absorbing what has been given. The stones still hold the echo of gongs, the air still carries a trace of incense, the ground still remembers petals scattered by dancers. The peace of Bali's temples is not only in their still courtyards at dawn, but also in the rhythm of movement and music that fills them, reminding all who witness that devotion can take many forms: flower, flame, or dance. Drifting now into the longer view, the temples of Bali appear not as frozen relics, but as living places, reshaped gently by centuries of change. Kingdoms rose and fell across the island. Dutch colonial forces pressed in. The tourist age arrived with its cameras and hotels, yet the rhythm of offerings and ceremonies never truly ceased. Temples endured by adapting, their quiet peace not the silence of abandonment, but the resilience of constant renewal. The earliest temples were tied to indigenous animist practices, venerating spirits of mountains, rivers, and trees. Later, waves of Indian influence brought Hindu epics, deities, and cosmologies, blending seamlessly with local traditions. The result was not a replacement, but a weaving gods of India standing alongside spirits of Bali, each honored with offerings of flowers, rice, and incense. Unlike in many parts of the world where new religions displaced old, in Bali the older layers were preserved, integrated into a tapestry that remains distinct today. Colonial times brought disruption, but not erasure. Dutch administrators catalogued temples, regulated festivals, and sometimes tried to contain what they saw as excessive ritual. Yet, the daily offerings persisted, too humble to suppress. A palm leaf basket of flowers on a doorstep could not be policed, and it was in those small acts that continuity survived. Even under foreign control, the hum of devotion carried on. The 20th century brought new pressures: war, independence, and tourism. Visitors drawn to Bali's beauty often treated temples as attractions, photographing ceremonies or entering sacred spaces without understanding. Some temples adjusted by creating designated performance areas, allowing tourists to watch dances without disturbing rituals. Others set boundaries, requiring sarongs and sashes for entry, reminding visitors that these were not ruins, but living sanctuaries. The balance was delicate, welcoming outsiders while protecting the sacred core. Tourism also brought new opportunities. Funds from visitors helped maintain temples, restore carvings, and support festivals. Villagers who once offered dances solely for gods now performed them for audiences, earning income while keeping traditions alive. Critics worried about spectacle overshadowing sincerity, yet many Balinese viewed it differently. The gods, after all, could be honored in any performance if the intention remained pure. The line between ritual and art blurred, but the devotion behind it did not vanish. Natural forces, too, have tested the temples. Mount Agyang erupted dramatically in 1963, spewing ash across the island and destroying villages. The Sakya temple, on its slopes, was threatened by lava flows that stopped just short of its courtyards. Many Balinese interpreted this as divine protection, a sign that the mother temple was preserved by the gods themselves. The eruption reinforced rather than weakened the sacred status of the mountain and its temple, reminding people of both fragility and resilience. Even in the modern age, the cycle of temple life remains intact. Families still weave offerings each morning. Villages still hold festivals according to lunar calendars, and the island's geography of mountain and sea temples still defines spiritual orientation. New materials, plastic baskets, factory-made cloth, sometimes slip into rituals, but the structure remains the same. The form may change, but the intention endures. In this endurance lies the quiet strength of Bali's temples. They are not frozen museums of a vanished culture, but active participants in daily life. Children play in their courtyards, priests chant at their shrines, tourists photograph their gates, and through it all the offerings accumulate, one basket after another, flowers upon flowers, smoke upon smoke. Continuity is not preserved by resisting change, but by folding it into the rhythm of devotion. For outsiders, it can be tempting to romanticize Bali's temples as timeless havens untouched by modernity. The reality is more nuanced. They exist within change, colonialism, tourism, modernization, but they absorb it without losing their essence. Their quiet peace is not the peace of stasis, but the peace of balance. Like water flowing steadily around stones, altering its course, but never ceasing. Walking through a temple today, one sees smartphones raised beside incense sticks, tourists in sarongs kneeling near villagers in daily prayer. It may feel contradictory, but to the Balinese the sacred is expansive enough to hold both. The gods are honored, the rituals continue, and the island's heartbeat carries on. The whispering peace of Bali's temples lies precisely in this resilience, their ability to remain rooted while the world shifts around them. Settling now into the final layer of this story, the temples of Bali stand revealed less as separate monuments and more as threads in the island's fabric. They are not simply places to visit, but patterns of living woven through households, villages, mountains, and seas. Their quiet power comes not from dramatic scale, but from steady rhythm, a rhythm so constant that it feels like the island breathing. Every dawn, incense smoke curls upward from courtyards, carrying with it the scent of flowers and rice. At noon, children run through temple courtyards, scattering petals beneath shrines that wait patiently for evening prayers. By dusk, gamelan tones shimmer in pavilions, preparing for festivals that will fill the night with dance and light. This cycle, repeated endlessly, makes the sacred inseparable from the ordinary. In Bali, devotion is not confined to a time or place, but saturates the day like sunlight or rain. The temple's quiet peace lies partly in their humility. They are not built to dominate skylines or awe with size. Their stones are porous with age, their carvings softened by moss, their offerings fragile and fleeting. Yet in that fragility is strength. The offerings will be remade tomorrow. The moss will return after every cleaning. The balance will be restored again and again, a constant renewal that defies finality. Unlike monuments meant to outlast time, Bali's temples endure by embracing it, letting change flow through them without losing their rhythm. This rhythm extends beyond architecture into the land itself. Volcanoes rise as guardians, rivers flow as lifelines, seas crash as reminders of both danger and renewal. Temples anchor these forces, shaping them into harmony. To stand at Berserkers beneath Mount Agung is to feel the immensity of the earth breathing beside you. To kneel at Tanalat with waves breaking at your feet is to feel the pulse of the ocean woven into prayer. The temples teach that peace is not the absence of power, but its balance. Even with modern pressures, tourism, development, the intrusion of cameras into ceremonies, the essence remains. Tourists may see dances as performances, but for the dancers they are still offerings. Visitors may crowd temple steps for sunset photos, but incense still burns. Priests still chant. Villagers still carry baskets of flowers and fruit. The gods are still invited, and the sacred still hums quietly beneath the spectacle. The resilience of Bali's temples is not in resisting attention, but in absorbing it, continuing their cycles regardless of who watches. The peace of these temples is also deeply human. It is found in the patient hands weaving offerings each morning, in the steady steps of villagers climbing paths for pilgrimage, in the concentration of children learning the gestures of ritual dance. Each act is small, almost invisible when taken alone, but together they create continuity across centuries. The temple is not preserved by stone walls alone, but by human devotion renewed daily. To walk among these temples, whether in a crowded festival or a silent dawn, is to feel both presence and absence. The presence of people who continue the rituals and the absence of anxiety about permanence. The structures may crumble, the offerings may decay, the festivals may change, yet the rhythm will continue, as natural as tides. This is the quiet lesson of Bali's temples. Peace is not carved once and preserved forever, but made fresh with every flower laid on an altar, every candle lit, every dance performed. And so the temples of Bali remain, not as relics, but as living companions. They hum with incense and gamelan, with prayers and laughter, with the rustle of palm leaves and the crash of waves. Their quietness is not silence, but balance, a steady whisper that reminds all who pause to listen that the sacred can be as near as the ground beneath your feet, as simple as a flower placed in a basket, as enduring as the rhythm of an island breathing in harmony. Endings are never final. They're stepping stones. The past leaves us clues, echoes, and whispers that carry us straight into the next twist in the long, unbroken chain of history. This is the lantern festivals of ancient China, light in the long night. When people today imagine the lantern festival in China, they might picture streets glowing with paper lanterns, floating lights rising into the sky, and a festive bustle of families gathered beneath them. But to understand this tradition, we have to drift far back to the dynasties that ruled long before neon lights and firecrackers, when lanterns were not only decoration but also statements of status, piety, and sometimes extravagant royal eccentricity. The Lantern Festival, in its earliest form, is generally tied to the Han Dynasty, which reigned from around 2 centuries before the Common Era into the early centuries after. This period was famous for laying down many of the foundations of imperial China, centralized bureaucracy, Confucian ideals woven into government, and elaborate ceremonial life. It was also a time when the court became increasingly creative in inventing and sponsoring spectacles that kept the public busy and their loyalty gently tethered to the throne. Lanterns flickering away in the winter darkness became one of those carefully cultivated distractions. The basic idea of the Lantern Festival was simple: hold a great public celebration on the 15th day of the first lunar month, when the moon was full and brilliant. The season was significant. It followed the Chinese New Year festivities and in older times marked the return of lengthening days after the long winter. There was a comforting symbolism in filling streets and palace courtyards with lanterns that imitated the moon's glow. But of course, the court was rarely satisfied with mere symbolism. The Han emperors and their successors used the festival to display both their wealth and their piety. Lanterns were not just lights, they were canvases, shaped and painted to represent cosmological themes, Buddhist icons, or sometimes just the most fashionable animals of the moment. By the Eastern Han period, Buddhism had begun filtering into China from Central Asia, carried by merchants and travelers along the Silk Roads. With it came an emphasis on light as a sacred offering. Lighting lamps and lanterns became not only an aesthetic choice, but also a religious duty for some believers. Records suggest that by the 1st and 2nd centuries, emperors like Emperor Ming of Han were ordering palace courtyards and temples to blaze with lanterns to honor the Buddha. It is easy to imagine the spectacle: silk lanterns stretched over bamboo frames, perhaps painted with gentle scenes of lotuses and clouds. The glow of oil-fed wicks, visible through the fabric. One could hardly miss the connection between the emperor's personal devotion and the public demonstration of his heavenly mandate. And if people happened to feel a little more loyal to the dynasty after seeing thousands of lanterns shining through the night, well, no one in the palace was going to complain. Of course, emperors rarely did things by halves. Lantern festivals became exercises in scale, with reports of vast numbers of lanterns ordered, counted, and displayed. The numbers in the records may be a little exaggerated. Scribes often enjoyed making their rulers seem larger than life. But even so, we can safely assume that many thousands of lanterns filled the capital streets. For commoners, this was both a welcome break from daily drudgery and a reminder of the hierarchy. The emperor could command the night itself to shine like day, and they, in turn, could walk beneath the glow as long as they remembered who had provided it. As dynasties changed, the lantern tradition lingered and grew. The Tang dynasty, which reigned from the 7th to the early 10th centuries, is often remembered for its cultural brilliance and for producing emperors and empresses who were not shy about showing off. Under the Tang, lantern festivals became positively theatrical. Empress Wu Zetian, the only woman ever to officially rule China as emperor, was especially keen on using public ceremonies to bolster her unusual claim to the throne. Lantern displays, elaborate processions, and nights of revelry fit her strategy perfectly. Imagine the imperial capital of Chang'an, its long boulevards lined with lanterns shaped like towers, dragons, or flowers, while the empress's court looked on from their elevated pavilions. The city must have seemed to float in a haze of light, with shadows dancing across its walls and gates. It was also in the Tang that the festival began to show some of its more playful, even raucous, elements. Public entertainment was encouraged, and the lines between solemn devotion and popular amusement blurred. Performers took to the streets, acrobats balanced on poles, and dancers moved in the lantern light. The elite, who might have preferred to think of lanterns as stately religious symbols, could do little but smile thinly, as ordinary people treated the night more like a carnival. The Lantern Festival became one of those rare times when the boundaries of class relaxed slightly, and even if only for an evening, the streets of Chang'an pulsed with shared enjoyment. But festivals were never purely carefree. They were also moments of strain for the officials tasked with maintaining order. Lanterns might look peaceful, but behind the scenes there were endless bureaucratic headaches. Funds had to be allocated, materials gathered, artisans conscripted, and when large crowds gathered under the lanterns, officials worried about crime, fire, or political unrest. A single lantern catching the wrong roof could lead to catastrophe, and reports exist of officials pleading for moderation, often to no avail. The emperors liked their festivals spectacular, and spectacular they would be, safety recommendations notwithstanding. As centuries passed, the Lantern Festival took root in local life, spreading far beyond the palace. Households began hanging their own lanterns, sometimes simple red globes, sometimes carefully painted works of art. The symbolism broadened. Lanterns could bring luck, protect against misfortune, or simply serve as a cheerful decoration. Children began carrying lanterns shaped like rabbits or fish, turning the festival into something both communal and personal. It was no longer only about imperial splendor, it was about families, neighborhoods, and the comfort of seeing the dark streets softened by warm light. Yet at the highest levels of society, lanterns continued to be tools of performance. Song dynasty emperors in the 10th through 13th centuries leaned into the festival with enthusiasm. Kaifeng, the Song capital, was renowned for its markets and its lively street culture, and the lantern festival there became an occasion for a kind of controlled chaos. The city's riverbanks and bridges filled with crowds. Vendors sold food under lantern light, and literati wrote poems about the moonlit throngs. Officials tried to maintain dignity, but one suspects that some of them ended up elbowed in the crowd, while others discreetly hired guards to clear a path. Lanterns themselves grew more elaborate, featuring revolving designs that used heat to spin painted panels, creating the illusion of movement. Technology, or at least a very clever use of rising hot air, became another way to impress the public. The Song emperors, especially those with fragile political situations, leaned on the festival's popularity to maintain a sense of stability. What better way to distract a restless population than with a glowing city that made the world feel safe, ordered, and beautiful? Even when wars loomed on the borders or court factions whispered against each other, the lanterns burned on schedule, like a promise that life would continue. In a way, it was a form of imperial stagecraft, one that relied less on military might and more on psychological comfort. Not all rulers, however, managed to handle the festival gracefully. Some were criticized for going overboard, spending extravagant sums on lanterns while neglecting other state duties. Records of Ming emperors describe years when massive wooden towers were constructed and covered in lanterns, sometimes so elaborate that they collapsed under their own weight before the festivities even began. It seems no dynasty was immune to the occasional embarrassing fiasco, but emperors often shrugged off the complaints. After all, what was the point of ruling if one couldn't occasionally order a 20-story glowing tower shaped like a lotus flower? Meanwhile, ordinary families carried on their quieter traditions. They solved lantern riddles, a practice that may have originated in the Song dynasty, where slips of paper with clever questions or word puzzles were hung on lanterns for passers-by to guess. This was part intellectual amusement, part social gain, and it allowed people to linger under the lights while debating answers. For young people, it was also an excuse to mingle in ways that everyday propriety might have discouraged. The lantern light became a strangely safe cover for courtship, and many later stories romanticized the festival as a place where eyes met across the glow. The emperors might have thought of it as a display of loyalty to the throne, but to a pair of young commoners, it might simply have been the moment they first smiled at one another over a solved riddle. By the Ming and Qing periods, the festival was fully entrenched as a national tradition, simultaneously elite and popular. Qing emperors who came from the Manchu minority and ruled a vast Han majority took particular interest in blending their own cultural practices with established Chinese tradition. Supporting the Lantern Festival helped them project continuity, even as they were foreign rulers. Records describe the imperial palace in Beijing, lit with lanterns, but also the city's huttongs and courtyards glowing as families joined in. It was both a state spectacle and a neighborhood ritual. Lanterns ranged from tiny handheld designs to immense dragons that required teams of people to carry. There is a faint irony in the endurance of the Lantern Festival. Dynasties rose and fell, emperors came and went, but the festival continued almost indifferently, as if to remind everyone that the light itself was more permanent than any single ruler. The emperors might have hoped the glow reflected their own greatness, but the people simply enjoyed the warmth, the puzzles, and the food. History is full of these small ironies, where traditions outlast the very powers that once promoted them. As the festival spread, it also inspired new technologies and crafts. The art of lantern making developed into a specialized skill with regional styles and workshops. Susho, for instance, became famous for its delicate silk lanterns, while other regions experimented with shapes and mechanical features. Artisans must have enjoyed the festival season immensely, since it practically guaranteed employment and admiration. If a particular emperor ordered thousands of lanterns, it could keep workshops busy for months. And while the ruler got his moment of glory, the artisans got paid, at least in theory. One suspects the actual flow of silver was sometimes less reliable than promised. The later centuries also saw the rise of floating lanterns, small paper constructions designed to drift on rivers or rise into the sky, powered by hot air. These were often associated with prayers or wishes, sent upward or downstream in hopes that someone, somewhere, perhaps the spirits, perhaps just fortune itself, might notice. The sight of hundreds of lanterns rising into the night air must have been mesmerizing, a quiet counterpart to the noise of firecrackers. But the practical-minded officials fretted again about fire hazards, probably with good reason. Wooden houses and paper lanterns do not make the safest combination, and it is almost miraculous that more disasters were not recorded. Still, for most people, the festival remained a time of joy and release. It capped the New Year season, offered a chance to stroll under glowing skies, and provided space for both reverence and mischief. The emperors might have used it as stagecraft, but the people had long since made it their own. The Lantern Festival became one of those cultural fixtures that blurred the line between official ritual and folk tradition, existing in both worlds at once. And as we drift further into its history, it becomes clear that each dynasty left its own particular mark on the way lanterns filled the night air. Continuing from that enduring glow, the lantern tradition carried subtle but telling changes as China's dynasties shifted, with each era imprinting its particular anxieties and ambitions onto the festival's gentle light. In the Yuan dynasty, ruled by the Mongol elite after their conquest in the 13th century, the Lantern Festival presented a unique challenge. The Mongol Khans were conquerors, not Confucian scholars, and their court often seemed culturally distant from the Chinese literati. Yet the Mongols understood spectacle. They realized quickly that adopting and supporting the Lantern Festival was a way of signaling legitimacy, even as they built palaces that looked more like nomadic tents writ large. It is said that lanterns in the Yuan period were sometimes arranged in towering wooden frames, which were lit in clusters so bright that they turned night into something like twilight. For a population skeptical of foreign rulers, a good lantern show was, if nothing else, a pacifying distraction. At the same time, the festival became more commercial. Guaran cities were bustling centers of trade, filled with merchants from Central Asia and beyond. Lantern markets flourished, where artisans sold not only lanterns but also toys, sweets, and other novelties. The blend of Mongol authority with Chinese tradition created an unusual atmosphere. On one hand, you might see aristocrats of the steppe enjoying a court lantern display. On the other, you might stroll through crowded stalls buying a rabbit-shaped lantern for a child. The layering of cultures meant that the festival became less about one single meaning and more about coexistence, though no doubt the Mongol rulers hoped people would see them as benevolent hosts of the light. When the Ming dynasty replaced the Yuan in the 14th century, the new rulers leaned heavily on Han Chinese traditions, presenting themselves as restorers of cultural order. They threw themselves into the Lantern Festival with gusto. Emperors ordered vast lantern towers built in palace courtyards, decorated with intricate carvings and glowing panels. These towers sometimes grew so tall and elaborate that they became engineering problems in their own right. Ming officials recorded, perhaps with quiet frustration, the logistics of assembling massive bamboo frames, hauling materials into the palace, and making sure everything did not collapse before the emperor had time to admire. If something did collapse, as occasionally happened, it was an embarrassment written in the records with a careful mix of understatement and dismay. Yet the Ming rulers were not content with palace shows alone. They encouraged citywide participation, sometimes even sponsoring lantern displays for the public. This was partly benevolence, partly politics. A glowing city suggested a prosperous reign. Even when court finances were stretched, Ming subjects embraced the opportunity, producing lanterns in endless variations. Dragons twisting upward, phoenixes spreading their wings, lotuses floating serenely, and even caricatures of popular figures. It was the age of artistry as much as pageantry. Lantern riddles became especially prominent, offering a kind of intellectual play that mingled scholarship with fun. A person could demonstrate wit by solving a riddle, or, if less successful, simply enjoy the excuse to stand under the lanterns a little longer. The Qing dynasty that followed in the 17th century also used the festival strategically. The Manchu rulers, foreigners in the eyes of many Han Chinese, faced the same challenge the Mongols once had: how to appear legitimate in a land with centuries of entrenched traditions. Supporting festivals like the Lantern Festival was one way to smooth cultural tensions. Records of the early Qing describe how emperors ordered lanterns to decorate both the palace and public spaces in Beijing. The capital, with its broad avenues and new imperial architecture, glowed under carefully managed displays. By staging themselves as patrons of the festival, the Qing emperors claimed continuity with the dynasties before them, even as their own customs and language marked them as outsiders. But if the palace lanterns were carefully orchestrated, the popular side of the festival thrived in its own chaotic way. Beijing's streets filled with lantern fairs where vendors hawked their creations, sometimes crude, sometimes masterfully crafted. Families carried lanterns through hotungs, and children competed with each other to show off the cleverness of their designs. Floating lanterns on rivers became especially popular in some regions, where streams of glowing lights drifted downstream, carrying wishes and prayers. The spectacle could be hauntingly beautiful, though perhaps less appreciated by the fishermen who had to navigate through the bobbing decorations. By this time, the Lantern Festival had long since become an essential part of the yearly cycle. People associated it with joy, reunion, and the gentle closure of the New Year season. The dynasty in power could sponsor larger displays or enforce stricter controls, but the festival belonged as much to the people as to the court. This dual nature gave it resilience. Even in times of war or hardship, lanterns still appeared in villages and towns. They might be fewer, dimmer, or more modest, but they remained. Light, after all, is one of the easiest things to conjure in the dark. There is something faintly ironic in how emperors tried to use lanterns as signs of their grandeur, only to see the tradition slip beyond their control. Claimed by ordinary families who hung their own lanterns regardless of palace budgets, a dynasty could collapse in flames, but the lanterns would flicker on the following year in alleys and courtyards. Scholars, in their dry way, sometimes remarked on this continuity. For the literati, The Lantern Festival was also a source of inspiration. Poets wrote verses comparing lanterns to stars scattered across the earth, or likening the glow to the clarity of virtue. Painters captured scenes of streets filled with light, often with a hint of nostalgia, as though trying to preserve in ink the fragile brilliance of a single night. Yet, amid all this celebration, officials continued to fret. Fire remained a constant hazard. Lanterns were made of silk or paper, lit by oil or candles, essentially delicate fire hazards waiting to happen. Edicts were sometimes issued forbidding lanterns in certain areas or restricting the size of displays. These prohibitions, like many others, were honored mostly in the breach. After all, what was the point of a festival of lanterns without actual lantern? The occasional accident was almost inevitable, but people kept lighting them anyway, balancing risk with tradition. Perhaps that is part of what made the glow feel precious. It was fleeting, fragile, and slightly dangerous. As centuries rolled on, lantern making itself grew into an art form with regional specialties. In Sichuan, lanterns were crafted to resemble moving scenes, with panels that turned to show people walking or fish swimming. In Suzhou, lanterns were celebrated for their delicacy, silk stretched thin over intricate frames. Each region developed its own flair, turning the festival into not just a cultural moment, but also a showcase of local craft. Workshops competed, artisans innovated, and buyers browsed for the most imaginative creations. To wander through a lantern market was to stroll through a glowing gallery where art and commerce blurred into one shimmering experience. Beyond artistry, the festival's timing carried symbolic weight. Coming on the first full moon of the year, it signaled completeness, harmony, and the promise of the year ahead. Families gathered, not only to admire lanterns, but also to eat yongshe, or tangyuan, sweet glutinous rice balls filled with sesame, red bean, or peanut paste. Their round shape symbolized reunion, mirroring the full moon above. The act of eating them together was as important as the lanterns themselves. It bound families in a shared ritual, sweet and slightly sticky, echoing the theme of unity that the glowing night proclaimed. One suspects that emperors might have found this domestic side of the festival slightly frustrating. They could order lantern towers and blazing palaces, but they could not control the intimacy of families eating rice balls together. That part of the festival lay beyond their reach, in kitchens and courtyards, where imperial power rarely intruded. Yet it was precisely this mixture of public spectacle and private warmth that gave the Lantern Festival its staying power. It was not just about seeing the emperor's grandeur. It was about the comfort of family, the excitement of riddles, the taste of sweet dumplings, and the magic of lights in the dark. The dynasties may have shifted, but the lanterns kept glowing, each generation adding new shapes, riddles, and memories. The festival had long since outgrown its origins in courtly display and Buddhist devotion, becoming instead a living tradition woven into the rhythms of everyday life. And as we drift forward, the stories of particular emperors and their sometimes overzealous attempts to outshine the moon add a layer of human comedy to the gentle beauty of the lights. Sliding further into the dynastic records, the Ming Emperor's relationship with the Lantern Festival provides a particularly revealing case study in the awkward marriage of imperial ego and fragile paper. Some of the Ming rulers were deeply committed to the idea that a glowing spectacle could reinforce their majesty, but their efforts often produced moments that were more comedic than commanding. For instance, certain records describe lantern towers so massive that they were essentially temporary skyscrapers of bamboo and wood, carefully wired together, draped in silk, and studded with countless lanterns. These towers dazzled the crowds when everything went right, but on windy nights they had an unnerving tendency to creak, tilt, or even collapse before the emperor had much time to bask in the public's admiration. It is hard to imagine anything less dignified than presiding over a tower of light that slowly buckles while courtiers pretend not to notice. The Ming emperors were not entirely oblivious to these risks, but restraint was rarely a favored trait at court. Records suggest that the costs of these spectacles could be staggering, requiring thousands of artisans, carpenters, and painters to labor for weeks or months in advance. Critics grumbled about waste and mismanagement, but the festival had acquired such symbolic importance that reigning emperors found it hard to cut back. A dimmer display could be read as a sign of waning power, so the cycle of extravagance continued, producing glowing nights for the people and headaches for the accountants. For ordinary citizens of the Ming cities, however, the festival was far less about imperial image and far more about community. Kaifeng and later Nanjing became known for their lively lantern fairs, with entire neighborhoods transformed into glowing mazes. Families paraded through the streets, children clutching animal-shaped lanterns while vendors shouted out riddles to anyone who would listen. Artisans delighted in producing lanterns that were not only beautiful, but also slightly whimsical. Records mention lanterns in the form of birds, fish, and even caricatures of contemporary figures. It is not difficult to picture a slightly mischievous artisan crafting a lantern that poked fun at an unpopular official, glowing merrily as crowds chuckled at the resemblance. The Qing dynasty inherited both the spectacle and the headaches. Emperors of the early Qing, keen to demonstrate their legitimacy, threw themselves into the lantern festival with enthusiasm. Yet as the dynasty settled into its long rule, some emperors began to treat the festival less as a tool of propaganda and more as a tradition they could personally shape. The Kangxi emperor, for example, allowed grand displays, but also emphasized restraint and decorum. The Qingdong emperor, his grandson, leaned in the opposite direction. Known for his love of pomp and art, he commissioned extravagant lantern shows that filled the palace courtyards with glowing dragons, towers, and revolving mechanical wonders. Qianlong was nothing if not ambitious about aesthetics, and his lantern festivals reflected that ambition in glowing color. But even in the Qing, there were limits. Fire hazards remained a constant worry, and edicts regulating lantern use continued to be issued with dreary regularity. One can almost hear the weary tone of the officials tasked with remaining people. Yet again, that paper, oil, and crowded wooden neighborhoods were a recipe for disaster. These reminders were about as effective as warnings to stop lighting fireworks near haystacks. People nodded politely, then carried on with their lanterns anyway. The sight of glowing lights against the night sky was too compelling to abandon. The people's side of the festival blossomed. Further in the Qing period, lantern riddles reached new popularity, becoming a central activity in many regions. Solving a riddle on a lantern was considered both amusing and respectable, a way of showing off literacy and wit in public. For young men and women, it offered a rare chance to interact socially in a festival atmosphere, which explains why later stories often romanticized lantern nights as settings for first meetings or courtships. Lantern light softened the rules of everyday propriety, allowing people to mingle under the cover of glow and shadow. At the same time, the craft of lantern making achieved new levels of artistry. Artisans produced lanterns with moving parts, panels that spun to create the illusion of running horses or swimming fish, driven by the heat of their own flames. Some lanterns were shaped like pagodas or palaces, with multiple tiers glowing from within. Others resembled mythical beasts or famous landscapes, transformed into shimmering sculptures of silk and bamboo. Each creation was both a technical marvel and a fleeting thing, destined to last only as long as the festival before fading into ashes or storage. That transience may have been part of the charm. Food traditions also deepened in this period. Tangayan, or yanyas, remained the essential dish of the festival. These sweet, riced dumplings, eaten in round bowls under the full moon, symbolized family reunion and harmony. Records suggest that even emperors made a show of eating them during the festival, though one imagines their bowls were served in more refined settings than the bustling street markets. Vendors sold tangayan to festival goers, sometimes flavored with sesame, sometimes with peanut or red bean. The sticky sweetness clung to the palate, reinforcing the idea that the festival was not only about sight, but also about taste and togetherness. By the later Qing period, especially in the 19th century, the festival faced new pressures. Foreign influences entered China through trade and conflict, and cities became sites of cultural friction. Yet the Lantern Festival continued. Missionaries noted with a mix of fascination and unease the glowing spectacles that filled streets each year. Some foreign observers tried to interpret the lanterns as purely religious offerings, others as mere entertainment, but both interpretations missed the point. It was both and more. For the Chinese public, the lanterns were layered symbols of light in darkness, of family reunion, of continuity in a world that often felt precarious. The irony is that while dynasties struggled to maintain their grip, the Lantern Festival endured as a steady fixture. The Qing dynasty eventually fell in the early 20th century, toppled by revolution, but the 15th day of the first lunar month still found families hanging lanterns and eating sweet dumplings. Emperors had used the glow for legitimacy. Revolutionaries tolerated it as culture. Through it all, the lanterns kept burning. And so, drifting into the modern age, the Lantern Festival carried with it centuries of imperial excess, artistic craft, popular joy, and bureaucratic grumbling, all bundled into one glowing night. Flowing from the last glimmers of dynastic grandeur into the turbulence of the modern age, the Lantern Festival did not fade away with the emperors. Instead, it adapted, sometimes shrinking, sometimes swelling, depending on the mood of the era. When the Qing collapsed in 1911 and the Republic of China was proclaimed, one might have expected the new leaders to dismiss old traditions as relics of imperial decadence. After all, the revolutionaries liked to portray themselves as modernizers, eager to shake off superstition and feudal baggage. Yet even the most ambitious reformers discovered that the Lantern Festival was stubbornly popular. Paper lanterns glowing in the first month of the lunar calendar were not something a government could easily ban without provoking discontent. People could live without imperial pageantry, but they were less willing to give up sweet rice dumplings and glowing family nights. In fact, during the early Republic years, the Lantern Festival found itself transformed into a symbol of cultural identity rather than dynastic power. Public displays continued in cities, though often on a smaller scale, with municipal authorities sponsoring lantern fairs. Families kept their household traditions alive, even as they navigated political uncertainty and occasional conflict. Some intellectuals argued that the festival should be preserved as folk culture, useful for building national pride. Others muttered about waste and fire hazards, repeating the same complaints that officials had voiced for centuries. Neither argument seemed to make much difference. Lanterns still appeared, year after year. During the turbulent decades of war in the 20th century, the festival sometimes fell into the background, overshadowed by larger crises. Yet even in times of scarcity, people found ways to mark the night. In some towns, children crafted lanterns from whatever materials were available, scraps of paper, tin cans, or glass jars, proof that the glow could survive, even in difficult circumstances. Soldiers stationed away from home wrote of missing the sight of lanterns, their absence a reminder of disrupted family life. In those years, the festival became less about grandeur and more about longing, a faint but resilient light amid uncertainty. When the People's Republic of China was established in 1949, the Lantern Festival entered another phase of adaptation. In the early decades, when official rhetoric emphasized breaking away from old customs, many traditional festivals were downplayed or discouraged. Lanterns, with their obvious ties to both folk religion and dynastic spectacle, were sometimes viewed with suspicion. Public displays dwindled, and in some regions, the festival was reduced to private family observances. Yet the human fondness for light and reunion proved difficult to suppress entirely. Lanterns still appeared in quiet courtyards, and yuanshao or tangyuan continued to be eaten on schedule, even if the glow was dimmer than in the past. By the late 20th century, the Lantern Festival experienced a revival as cultural policies shifted and traditions were re-evaluated as part of national heritage. Lantern displays returned in force. Cities began hosting official lantern fairs once again, complete with elaborate installations, towering glowing sculptures, and crowds of visitors. What had once been a dynastic tool of propaganda re-emerged as a form of cultural tourism. The irony is hard to miss. Emperors spent fortunes building glowing towers to impress their subjects, and modern city governments did much the same, except this time the subjects bought tickets and took photos. Technology also transformed the experience. Where once lanterns relied on fragile bamboo frames and oil-fed flames, modern displays incorporated electric bulbs, colored lights, and even animated figures powered by motors. Traditionalists sometimes frowned at the shift, arguing that the authentic charm of paper and fire was being lost. But the crowds came anyway, enjoying the spectacle even if it glowed with LEDs rather than candles. In some places, floating sky lanterns became wildly popular, rising into the night sky in great clusters. Officials continued to issue worried warnings about fire hazards, and one suspects they did so with the same weary tone as their king predecessors. At the same time, families maintained the quieter side of the tradition. Sweet rice dumplings never disappeared, and riddles still dangled from lanterns, waiting for clever answers. Children continued to carry their glowing animals, whether shaped from paper or molded from plastic. The combination of public display and private ritual remained, just as it had through centuries of change. It is worth noting that the Lantern Festival is not only celebrated in mainland China. It spread long ago to other parts of East Asia, including Taiwan, where the Pingxi Sky Lantern release became especially famous. Thousands of glowing lanterns are released into the night sky, carrying written wishes upward. The sight has become iconic, though not without its critics who worry about litter and safety. In southern China, dragon and lion dances are often woven into the Lantern Festival, adding rhythmic drumming and swirling movement to the glow. Each region puts its own stamp on the tradition, just as earlier dynasties once did. As the festival entered the global age, it began to appear beyond Asia as well. Chinese communities abroad carried the tradition with them, lighting lanterns in San Francisco, Singapore, London, and Sydney. Sometimes the festival was adapted for local contexts, blending with multicultural celebrations. Lantern festivals became a way of connecting diasporic families to their heritage, while also introducing neighbors to the beauty of glowing lights in the dark. Modern festivals often featured both traditional paper lanterns and large, elaborate installations designed for public parks and tourist crowds. The line between cultural tradition and commercial spectacle blurred again, though perhaps no one minded too much. The endurance of the Lantern Festival, through so many transformations, raises a quiet question. What exactly gives it such resilience? Perhaps it is the simplicity of the idea. A lantern is nothing more than a frame, a thin cover, and a light. Yet together, these elements create an effect that feels greater than the sum of its parts. Lanterns glow softly rather than harshly, warming the darkness rather than banishing it. They create an atmosphere where families can walk, children can play, and people can pause to reflect. For emperors, this effect was useful. For ordinary people, it was comforting. The continuity suggests that whatever rulers intended, the festival became indispensable to the fabric of life. It is also telling that the Lantern Festival centers on reunion, riddles, and sweet food, rather than conquest or ritualized violence. It is a holiday about light and warmth, not about fear or power. Even the most extravagant imperial displays were ultimately designed to delight, rather than intimidate. This gentleness may explain why the tradition has traveled so far and lasted so long. And as we drift further into the present, the festival continues to evolve, balancing heritage and novelty, paper and plastic, candle and electric light. Each generation reshapes it slightly, but the essence remains: the long night, softened by warm glow, laughter under lanterns, and the enduring comfort of light in darkness. Drifting deeper into the meaning of the Lantern Festival, one begins to see how it has always operated on several layers at once: religious offering, political theater, neighborhood carnival, and intimate family ritual. This layering is part of why it has survived dynasties, revolutions, and modernization. Each group, whether imperial courtiers, common villagers, or modern city officials, could see their own reflection in the glow, and each insisted that their interpretation was the correct one. Yet the lanterns themselves seemed content to remain ambiguous, flickering politely, while everyone argued over their significance. The earliest layers were steeped in Buddhist devotion, as we have already traced. Lanterns were lit as symbolic offerings, gestures of enlightenment in the literal and spiritual sense. The association between light and wisdom, between flame and transcendence, meant that even a simple household lantern carried a touch of sacred weight. Families who hung lanterns were not only decorating their homes, but also aligning themselves, however modestly, with the great cycle of faith that had traveled along the Silk Roads. This religious undertone never fully vanished, even as centuries reshaped the festival into something far broader. A Tang or Song emperor might claim the glow was a reflection of his cosmic mandate, but a grandmother lighting a lantern for the Buddha at her local temple was making an entirely different statement. The coexistence of these meanings kept the tradition elastic and durable. At the political level, lanterns were tools of legitimacy. Emperors used them to demonstrate prosperity, order, and cultural authority. A city glowing with lanterns looked stable, harmonious, and united, even if beneath the surface the bureaucracy was fraying or border wars loomed. Imperial spectacles were, in that sense, exercises in stagecraft, not unlike modern fireworks shows or national parades. They reassured the population that everything was under control, that the dynasty still had the mandate of heaven. Of course, the joke was that the lanterns glowed whether the dynasty was strong or not. The public enjoyed the show, then went home, sometimes more comforted, sometimes less convinced. The emperors were borrowing the festival's inherent charm and trying to staple it onto their own reputation. with results that varied according to circumstance. The communal side of the festival carried its own power in towns and villages. The Lantern Festival was often the most sociable night of the year. Families poured into the streets, neighbors mingled, and children were allowed to stay up past their usual bedtime. Glowing animals in hand, riddles dangled from lanterns, invited people to linger, laugh, and puzzle together. Vendors hawked tang yuan, candied fruits, or savory snacks, turning the streets into impromptu banquets. It was a time when the rules relaxed slightly, when the normal hierarchies softened, rich or poor, young or old. Everyone walked the same streets under the same lanterns, even if subtle distinctions of dress and manner remained. The shared light blurred them a little. For a few hours, the night belonged to everyone. On the intimate level, the Lantern Festival was about family bonds. The roundness of the rice dumplings mirrored the roundness of the moon, symbolizing completeness. Eating them together affirmed unity, even when families were stretched by distance or hardship. In literature and later popular culture, the Lantern Festival often appears as a setting for love stories, with young people meeting under lanterns or exchanging glances across the glow. These stories may be embellished, but they capture something true. The festival created space for interactions that everyday propriety might have stifled. The lights softened boundaries, offering moments of warmth where strict Confucian etiquette temporarily loosened. Another layer worth drifting through is the artistry itself. The craft of lantern making became a respected skill, with regional traditions and family workshops. Some artisans specialized in delicate silk lanterns, others in large wooden frames, others in ingenious revolving designs powered by rising heat. The competition to impress was constant. During imperial times, artisans could gain recognition if their work was chosen for palace displays. For families, buying an especially clever lantern was a matter of pride. Even today, regional lantern festivals showcase this artistry, with themes ranging from traditional dragons and phoenixes to modern cartoon characters. The adaptability of lantern design ensured that the tradition never grew stale. There is also the sensory texture of the festival. Imagine wandering through a Ming or Qing street on festival night. The smell of sesame oil from frying tang yuan, the faint smokiness of candles burning inside paper globes, the chatter of vendors, the laughter of children, the rustle of silk robes brushing past, the occasional crack of firecrackers in the distance. Above, the moon gleamed, mirrored by thousands of glowing lanterns swaying gently in the night air. The entire atmosphere was saturated with warmth and movement, a living landscape of sound and light. These sensory details, more than any official proclamation, etched the festival into memory. The contradictions that ran through the festival are equally intriguing. Officials issued stern warnings about fire safety, then lit their own elaborate displays. Emperors claimed the lantern glow demonstrated their virtue, while commoners used the same glow to play games and court sweethearts. Intellectuals praised the riddles as refined entertainment, while artisans delighted in selling lanterns shaped like animals or humorous caricatures. The festival was both serious and playful, sacred and profane, lofty and earthy. Perhaps that tension is why it lasted. It gave everyone a place without demanding a single interpretation. Even in the modern era, these layers persist. Governments sponsor lantern fairs as tourist attractions. Intellectuals write essays about their cultural significance. Artisans craft elaborate designs, and families simply gather to eat dumplings and enjoy the glow. Each level reinforces the others. The spectacle draws crowds. The artistry impresses. The riddles amuse. The dumplings comfort. The lanterns themselves remain quietly indifferent to their many uses. glowing faithfully year after year. If one drifts back to the image of emperors commissioning towers of light, the irony becomes sharp. Dynasties collapsed, revolutions overturned governments, but the 15th day of the first lunar month still finds lanterns glowing across China and beyond. The emperors may have believed they were immortalizing their rule in light, but it was the lanterns, not the dynasties, that proved immortal. The people carried the tradition forward, reshaping it with each generation. And so, the Lantern Festival is best understood not as a single thing, but as a constellation of meanings, flickering together like so many lights on a dark night. Religious devotion, political stagecraft, communal festivity, family intimacy, artistic craft. All these threads intertwine, forming a tapestry that stretches across centuries. The lanterns shine on, indifferent to emperors and regimes, loyal only to the simple human need for warmth, reunion, and light in the long night, floating now into reflection. The Lantern Festival appears less as a fixed holiday and more as a mirror of China's long history, catching bits of each dynasty, each upheaval, and each quiet household in its glow. It began as a gesture of Buddhist devotion, an imperial display, then expanded outward until it was claimed by the entire population. From artisans stringing bamboo frames to families spooning sweet dumplings into bowls, the emperors tried to bend it toward their own image, but the light slipped from their grasp, becoming something too flexible and too beloved to be controlled. There is a strange humility to the lantern itself. It is fragile, impermanent, made of paper or silk, stretched over delicate frames, its flame flickering in the draft. It lasts a night, perhaps two, before wilting or burning away, and yet, across centuries, those fragile globes outlasted the very palaces where emperors once displayed them. Bamboo towers collapsed, dynasties crumbled, revolutions swept through, but the paper lanterns returned each spring, fragile and persistent. That paradox, weak in substance, strong in endurance, may be the quiet secret of the festival's survival. The symbolism of light is, of course, universal. But in China, where dynasties tied legitimacy to cosmic order, the Lantern Festival carried special resonance. The first full moon of the new year, glowing round and whole, signaled harmony. To light lanterns beneath it was to echo the heavens, to say that unity existed on earth as well as in the sky. For families, that meant reunion. For emperors, it meant a stable reign. For poets, it meant a chance to write verses about moons, dumplings, and fleeting glances. Each group borrowed the same image of light and gave it its own meaning. The dry humor of history lies in the repetition of worries. Officials fretted about fire hazards in the Tang, in the Song, in the Ming, in the Qing, and in modern city governments as well. The warnings were always the same. Too many lanterns, too close together, too much risk, and yet every year, the lanterns came back. Human affection for warmth and glow outweighed bureaucratic anxiety. Fires occasionally broke out, towers occasionally collapsed, but the festival endured anyway. The tension between risk and beauty was part of the charm, as though the glow were more precious, because it might vanish in an instant. If one imagines wandering through time, the festival would be a reassuring constant. In Chang'an of the Tang, you would walk beneath elaborate silk lanterns painted with celestial motifs. In Kaifeng of the Song, you would see revolving lanterns spinning images of fish and flowers. In Beijing of the Ming, towering bamboo frames would blaze against the night. In a Qing village, children would carry rabbit-shaped lanterns while vendors ladled out tangyuan. In modern Taipei, sky lanterns would drift upward in their thousands, each carrying a wish. Across 2 millennia, the details shift, but the rhythm remains. Lanterns glowing against the first full moon, laughter in the streets, dumplings in bowls, riddles fluttering in the breeze. The festival also reveals a rare softness in political culture. Many imperial rituals were rigid, hierarchical, and intimidating. The Lantern Festival, by contrast, was playful, sometimes even chaotic. It allowed emperors to appear generous, officials to mingle uneasily with crowds, and commoners to claim the streets for themselves. It was a safety valve, a night when order gave way to glow and bustle. That loosening may have been unsettling to the bureaucrats, but it was necessary for the people, and perhaps for the stability of the realm itself. In the global age, the Lantern Festival has become a symbol not only of Chinese tradition, but of cultural endurance more broadly. Chinese communities abroad string lanterns across streets in San Francisco, Singapore, or Sydney, connecting themselves to a heritage that dynasties could not erase. Tourists flock to see lantern fairs, snapping photos of glowing dragons and towers, while children in diaspora neighborhoods carry paper animals just as children did in Ming alleyways. The meaning shifts, but the light remains. Ultimately, the Lantern Festival is not about emperors or dynasties, though they tried to make it so. It is not even solely about religion, though it grew from devotion. It is about the persistence of simple human joys, light in darkness, warmth in cold, reunion after separation, beauty in fragility. That is why it has lasted. Dynasties fall, governments rise, but people still crave the comfort of gathering under a glowing sky. The lanterns, fragile as they are, hold that comfort year after year. So when the 15th night of the first lunar month arrives, and lanterns sway under the full moon, what glows is not only paper and flame, but centuries of continuity. It is the weight of dynasties, the laughter of families, the craft of artisans, the verses of poets, the long record of history, all condensed into one night of light, a long night softened by glow, repeating itself endlessly, like the moon above, reminding each generation that some traditions, however fragile, endure beyond empires. One flame flickers out, but another sparks in the dark, daring us to follow, and with it begins a story more haunting, more hidden, and impossible to ignore. This is Viking Berserkers, myth, mushrooms, and mayhem. The image of the Viking berserker has become something of a cultural cliché. Wild-eyed warriors frothing at the mouth, charging half-naked into battle, immune to pain and apparently more beast than man. The word itself has slipped into modern English as shorthand for someone acting with uncontrollable fury. But as with many legends, the truth of the berserkers is both stranger and duller than the later myths suggest. Their story drifts between historical record, literary embellishment, and modern speculation, leaving us with a haze of fact and fable that flickers like torchlight in a smoky longhouse. To begin with, the word berserker comes from Old Norse, usually explained as bear shirt or sometimes bear shirt. The exact meaning is still debated, which is fitting for figures so wrapped in ambiguity. Bear shirt suggests warriors who fought clad in animal skins, perhaps believing they took on the strength of the beast. Bear shirt implies they went into battle without armor, either out of bravery or simple recklessness. Either way, the name marked them as different from ordinary fighters, and that sense of difference lingered through centuries of storytelling. The earliest accounts of berserkers come from Norse sagas and poetry, some of which were written down in Iceland centuries after the Viking Age had passed. This timing complicates matters. By the time the stories were preserved, memory, and myth had already intertwined. In the sagas, berserkers are described as terrifying shock troops, seizing sudden fury in what was called a berserker's gang, a berserker rage. They howled, bit their shields, and threw themselves at enemies with abandon. Once the frenzy faded, they were said to collapse in exhaustion, vulnerable until they recovered. It makes for a vivid tale and perhaps a practical battlefield tactic. If your enemies believe you are impervious to fear or pain, they may hesitate long enough for you to cut them down. But did such warriors truly exist, or were they literary exaggerations? Scholars continue to debate the point. Some argue that berserkers were real, a cult-like brotherhood within Viking society, possibly tied to Odin worship. Others suspect they were mostly the invention of later writers, exaggerating the bravery and violence of ordinary warriors. The truth likely lies somewhere in between. Certain fighters may have cultivated wild reputations, and over time, their exploits grew into larger-than-life legend. One theory that often surfaces is the idea that berserkers fueled their rages with intoxicants. The most famous candidate is the hallucinogenic mushroom, Amanita muscaria, the red-capped toadstool dotted with white spots, the very one often pictured under cartoon gnome. Some modern writers have suggested that consuming this mushroom could have triggered the berserker's frenzy, producing hallucinations, bursts of energy, and numbness to pain. The theory is colorful, and it fits neatly with the image of berserkers as half-crazed mystics, yet the evidence for it is thin. No medieval source mentions mushroom use, and Amanita muscaria can just as easily cause nausea, disorientation, and a very unpleasant evening. It might turn a warrior into a liability rather than a terrifying force. Still, the idea persists, probably because it feels so poetically appropriate. Mushroom-fueled madness fits the modern taste for Viking wildness. Other suggestions include alcohol, henbane seeds, or simply psychological techniques, ritualized chanting, drumming, or self-hypnosis. It is not difficult to imagine a group of warriors working themselves into a trance-like state before battle, their own adrenaline providing the fuel for frenzy. In that sense, berserker rage might have been less about substances and more about deliberate performance, both for themselves and for their enemies. If you believe you are unstoppable, and your foes believe it too, the battle has already tilted in your favor. The association of berserkers with animals is another recurring theme. Some sagas describe them as shapeshifters, taking on the form of bears or wolves in their frenzy. This likely connects to Odin, the one-eyed god, often linked to warriors, sorcery, and transformation. Warriors who devoted themselves to Odin may have donned animal skins, howled like wolves, and fought as if possessed by the spirit of the beast. To modern readers, it sounds theatrical, even absurd, but in a world where belief in magic and omens was woven into daily life, such performance had real psychological weight. Enemies who believed they faced a man-beast hybrid might falter, and allies who believed they fought alongside one might feel emboldened. The power of belief should not be underestimated, especially in the chaos of early medieval warfare. Yet, not all accounts paint berserkers in a favorable light. Some sagas describe them as thugs or troublemakers, prone to fits of violence even outside the battlefield. They might challenge others to duels, disrupt feasts, or lash out unpredictably. In these tales, berserkers are as much a danger to their own communities as to their enemies. This dual image, heroic shock troops on one hand, drunken brawlers on the other, suggests that Norse society admired their bravery but remained wary of their volatility. They were useful But they were also disruptive. The same traits that made them terrifying in war made them hard to manage in peace. As Christianity spread through Scandinavia, berserkers came to be viewed less as sacred warriors and more as dangerous relics of paganism. Laws from the later medieval period explicitly banned berserker practices, treating them as antisocial and disruptive. By then, the cult of the berserker, if it had ever been formalized, had largely faded. What remained was the memory, crystallized in sagas and folklore, of men who had fought like beasts. The glow of legend did the rest, transforming messy historical reality into neat myth. And so the berserkers straddle an odd line, real enough to appear in multiple sources, yet vague enough to invite endless speculation. Were they an actual brotherhood of Odin-worshipping warriors, or just an exaggeration of rowdy fighters? Did they chew mushrooms, chant themselves into frenzy, or simply ride adrenaline? The answers may never be entirely clear. What we do know is that they left a cultural mark far larger than their actual numbers could have been. Few societies remember their ordinary soldiers, but the berserkers, with their wild eyes and shield-biting antics, etched themselves permanently into memory. If nothing else, they remind us that warfare has always had its theatrical side. The battlefield is not only a place of steel and blood, but also of image and impression. A berserker's rage, whether chemically induced, spiritually summoned, or purely performed, was as much about psychology as it was about strength. Fear spreads quickly, and the sight of one man howling like a beast could ripple through an enemy line more effectively than any sword stroke. The Vikings, pragmatic as they were, likely understood this well. And so, as we drift forward into the sagas and later interpretations, we find berserkers transformed, yet again, their image reshaped by each generation that retold their story. Sliding deeper into the sagas, we find that the literary portrayals of berserkers are almost as contradictory as the theories about them. In some stories, they are the awe-inspiring champions of kings, dispatched to the front lines like living battering rams. In others, they are more like cautionary figures, prone to starting brawls at feasts or challenging respectable men to duels, just to prove a point. It seems the Norse storytellers were not sure whether to admire berserkers or roll their eyes at them, which is probably a clue that real communities felt the same ambivalence. Consider the Ynglinga saga, a 13th century text that traces the lineage of early Scandinavian kings. There, berserkers are described in glowing terms as Odin's chosen warriors. They went into battle without armor, seized by such fury that they killed men, but neither fire nor iron could bite them. It is hard not to hear the mythic exaggeration in those words. Yet it also reveals how Norse society imagined the perfect warrior, fearless, invulnerable, devoted to the god of war and wisdom. To be described in such terms was high praise, even if the reality was probably closer to a man shouting a lot and swinging his axe with questionable technique. Other sagas, however, are less flattering. In the Egil saga, for instance, berserkers appear not as noble champions but as disruptive nuisances. They demand marriages, stir up quarrels, and occasionally get themselves killed by heroes who refuse to tolerate their antics. In these tales, the berserkers embody dangerous excess, strength without discipline, courage without wisdom. It was one thing to unleash such men on a battlefield, quite another to invite them to a wedding feast. The sagas therefore present a spectrum of berserker images, admired for their ferocity, distrusted for their volatility. This duality points to the awkward role of violence in Norse society. On one hand, strength and courage were highly valued, and a man who fought fearlessly could earn glory. On the other, communities depended on order, stability, and cooperation. Berserkers symbolized both extremes. They were the distilled essence of warrior ideals, and at the same time, they were reminders of how easily those ideals could spiral into chaos. A hero might be praised for going berserk in a desperate battle, but if he behaved that way every day, he was just a menace. The supposed supernatural qualities of berserkers also deserve attention. Many sagas describe them as immune to ordinary weapons during their rage. Of course, no human is actually blade-proof, but the claim reflects a deeper cultural logic. To the Norse imagination, men in the grip of Odin's power were not quite men anymore. They had crossed into the realm of the uncanny, where ordinary rules did not apply. Stories of shape-shifting, where berserkers became bears or wolves, follow the same pattern. Whether or not anyone literally believed a man transformed into a bear, the metaphor carried weight. He fought with the ferocity and unpredictability of a beast. This imagery also connected to existing cult practices. Evidence suggests that animal cults, particularly those linked to bears and wolves, existed in Germanic and Scandinavian traditions long before the Viking Age. Warriors may have donned animal pelts, performed rituals, or taken on beastly names as part of initiation rites. The berserkers, in this light, were heirs to older traditions of animal identity, carrying them forward into the battlefield. Their fury was not random madness, but the deliberate assumption of an animal spirit, sanctioned by Odin himself. Still, even when couched in sacred language, berserker behavior could be deeply inconvenient for kings and jarls who needed disciplined troops. A berserker's value was highest in the first charge of battle, when his reckless energy could scatter an enemy line. After that, he might become less useful, or worse, a liability. Sagas hint at this problem when they describe berserkers collapsing after their fury passed, drained and vulnerable. In those moments, ordinary fighters had to protect them, which must have tested the patience of commanders. The berserker's glory was brief and spectacular, but it was not a sustainable fighting style. Some scholars have compared berserkers to warrior fraternities found in other cultures, groups of young men bound by ritual, prone to excess, and often occupying a liminal space between society and exile. Such groups can be useful in war, but disruptive in peace. In that sense, berserkers may have been a predictable byproduct of Viking society, which valued martial skill, yet also struggled to contain it. Communities needed warriors, but they also needed farmers, traders, and stable households. The berserker embodied the tension between those roles. As Christianity gradually replaced pagan religion in Scandinavia, the cultural status of berserkers declined. What once looked like divine possession now looked like sinful madness. Church authorities discouraged the old animal cults, and laws began to forbid berserker behavior explicitly. By the 11th and 12th centuries, being accused of going berserk was not a compliment, but a charge of antisocial violence. The once sacred rage became a punishable offense, and the men who cultivated it faded from real communities into the pages of saga literature. Even so, the legend proved sticky. Writers preserved tales of berserkers not only because they made for dramatic stories, but also because they embodied the contradictions of the Viking past, glorious and dangerous, admirable and ridiculous. Later audiences, both medieval and modern, continued to be fascinated by the idea of men who crossed the line between human and beast, order and chaos. It is easy to see why the berserker is the ultimate fantasy of unrestrained power, the dream of being unstoppable, no matter the odds. And yet, as the sagas remind us, that dream comes at a cost. Once the frenzy fades, the warrior collapses, drained and defenseless. In that moment, the invulnerable man is just another exhausted fighter, his glory as fragile as the wooden shield he gnawed upon. The myth of the berserker, for all its fury, contains its own quiet irony. Power is fleeting, and even the fiercest rage burns itself out. From this perspective, the berserker becomes less a literal figure and more a symbol of human extremes. The allure of losing control, the danger of too much strength, and the inevitable collapse that follows. It is a myth that resonates because it touches something recognizable in human experience, even if most of us have never bitten a shield on a battlefield. And so, as we drift onward, we find that the afterlife of the berserker, how later generations remembered, romanticized, or misunderstood them, may be even stranger than their supposed reality. Floating onward into the afterlife of the berserker legend, we discover that their story did not end with the sagas. In many ways, the real transformation of berserkers began after they had already vanished from the battlefield. Once their practices were outlawed and their cultic associations faded, they became creatures of literature and imagination. And in that space, they grew larger, stranger, and more colorful than any real fighter could have hoped to be. Medieval Icelandic authors, writing centuries after the supposed Viking Age, found berserkers to be irresistible characters. They spiced up otherwise straightforward tales of inheritance disputes and family feuds. A saga without at least one shield-biting maniac would be like a feast without mead, still functional, but missing a certain chaotic charm. These later authors also knew their audience. Listeners wanted drama, exaggeration, and a few characters outrageous enough to make the heroes look reasonable by comparison. The berserkers filled that role perfectly, terrifying in battle, but equally suitable for being defeated in spectacular fashion by the protagonist. The Christian influence is easy to spot in these stories. Berserkers were often cast as villains, their uncontrollable fury portrayed as unholy rather than divine. They disrupted feasts, challenged respectable men, and had to be brought down by heroes who combined strength with moral order. In this way, the sagas turned the berserker into a kind of narrative scapegoat. He embodied the dangerous, pagan, chaotic energy of the old world, which the new Christian order could then conquer and tame. It was a neat bit of cultural editing, preserve the excitement of berserkers, but make sure they lose in the end. Beyond Iceland, the memory of berserkers seeped into broader European imagination. Chroniclers outside Scandinavia sometimes mentioned strange northern warriors who fought like beasts, immune to fear and pain. These references were often second-hand and colored by exoticism. To a monk writing in a cloister in Germany or England, the idea of half-mad warriors from the cold north fit perfectly with existing stereotypes of Scandinavians as wild and uncivilized. Whether the chroniclers believed these stories or simply repeated them for dramatic effect is hard to say, but either way, the berserker image spread beyond its original cultural soil. By the early modern period, the figure of the berserker had become more myth than memory. Antiquarians and folklorists in the 18th and 19th centuries rediscovered the sagas, and with them, the image of berserkers. Romantic writers seized on the concept with enthusiasm. For them, the berserker represented the untamed vitality of the Viking past, a symbol of raw northern energy, unspoiled by civilization. Painters depicted them with bulging muscles, wild hair, and animal pelts, usually posed mid-charge, weapons raised, eyes gleaming with rage. The subtle ambivalence of the sagas was lost in translation. What remained was pure, glorious violence. This romanticized image suited the 19th century well. Nationalist movements in Scandinavia and Germany were busy constructing proud histories, and nothing said ancient strength quite like a troop of berserkers. Scholars dug into linguistic roots, artists produced heroic tableaux, and popular culture absorbed the berserker as an emblem of fearless northern ancestry. Never mind that the real berserkers may have been more nuisance than nobility. The myth had taken on a life of its own. Modern theories about berserker frenzy also emerged during this revival. The mushroom hypothesis, for example, became popular in the 20th century, though it lacks solid historical evidence. The appeal is obvious. The image of a warrior gnawing on a red and white toadstool before charging into battle is vivid and memorable. Similarly, suggestions of alcohol, henbane, or trance-inducing rituals gain traction. Each theory reflects less about Viking practice and more about modern fascination with altered states. People like to imagine that berserker rage must have had some chemical trigger, because the alternative, that men deliberately cultivated madness through sheer will and performance, feels almost too unsettling. Pop culture, of course, took the berserker image and ran with it. Comic books, films, and video games have repeatedly drawn on the stereotype of the berserker as the ultimate barbarian warrior, unstoppable until spent. Modern fantasy settings often feature berserker-like characters who enter battle rages immune to pain and reason. The role-playing game Dungeons & Dragons, for instance, includes a barbarian class that channels rage into superhuman combat power, a direct descendant of Norse tales filtered through centuries of reinvention. The Marvel Comics character Wolverine, with his berserker rages, owes a quiet debt to the Old Norse archetype as well. Even in everyday English, the word berserk has drifted far from its original context. Few people today think of bear shirts or Odin's warriors when they describe a toddler going berserk in a grocery store aisle. The term has softened into shorthand for uncontrolled outbursts of any kind, but linguistic survival is a testament to the lasting power of the myth. A fragment of Viking cultural performance still lingers in modern speech, long after the battles and sagas. Yet, beneath the exaggerations and modern appropriations, the core fascination remains the same. The berserker is the embodiment of unrestrained fury, the dream or nightmare of stepping outside ordinary human limits. For some, that image is inspiring. The idea of transcending fear and pain, of becoming unstoppable. For others, it is disturbing. The vision of violence without control, strength without conscience. That tension is exactly why the berserker legend endures. It is not merely about Vikings. It is about human ambivalence toward rage itself. The quiet ironies that berserkers, so often imagined as eternal warriors, were likely very mortal, very fallible men. They may have been brave, but they also collapsed in exhaustion. They may have been feared, but they were also scorned. They may have been admired in sagas, but they were outlawed in real law codes. Their myth is larger than life, but their reality was probably as messy as any other human story, and perhaps that is what makes them compelling. The glow of legend softens the sharp edges of truth, leaving us with something that's strange and familiar. As we drift onward, we find that the berserker legend not only illuminates Viking society, but also reflects broader human patterns. Our fascination with extremes, our tendency to mythologize violence, and our uneasy relationship with the idea of losing control. Sliding further along the current of interpretation, the berserker figure begins to look less like a specific warrior and more like a cultural mirror. When we look closely at the ways later societies use the image, we see that each era reshaped the berserker to suit its own anxieties and aspirations. The Vikings may have feared or admired their shield-biting cousins, but the medieval church painted them as cautionary tales of pagan chaos. Romantic nationalists celebrated them as avatars of primeval strength. Modern pop culture reduced them to shorthand for rage and recklessness. The poor berserker never had much control over his own reputation, though, to be fair, that seems appropriate for a man defined by his lack of control. Part of the enduring appeal lies in how berserkers dramatized the edge between order and chaos. In Norse cosmology, this edge was already central. The world balanced between the ordered realm of the gods and the wild forces beyond. Berserkers embodied that balance in human form. They lived among society, but stepped outside its norms in moments of frenzy. They were kin, yet also beastly. They served kings, but threatened households. They were, in essence, liminal figures, halfway between categories, and therefore both fascinating and unsettling. Human cultures often tell stories about such liminal beings, whether they are shamans, werewolves, or tricksters. The berserker fits neatly into that pattern. It is also worth noting that Viking warfare itself encouraged spectacle. Battles in the early medieval North were not vast clashes of professional armies. They were smaller, chaotic encounters where morale mattered as much as numbers. A single terrifying figure could sway the outcome, especially if he seemed invulnerable or possessed. The berserker's howling charge, his refusal to wear armor, his apparent indifference to pain, all of these were performances designed to manipulate psychology. In that sense, the berserker was less about brute strength and more about theater. His rage was a stage play acted out in real blood and steel. This theatrical quality may help explain why the image survived so vividly in literature, even long after the battles ended. The idea of a warrior turning into a beast made for irresistible storytelling. It gave authors a way to explore themes of control, identity, and transformation. Was the berserker noble or monstrous? Was his power divine gift or dangerous excess? By asking these questions in saga form, writers gave shape to deeper cultural debates about the place of violence in society. The uneasy ambivalence shows up in law codes as well. When Christianity spread, the berserker was increasingly defined not as a blessed warrior, but as a criminal. Medieval Norwegian laws, for example, specifically forbade berserkering, the act of going berserk. Men who did so could be punished, stripped of rights, or exiled. This shift reveals a society trying to suppress old pagan rituals and replace them with Christian norms of order. What had once been tolerated as a sacred frenzy became classified as antisocial violence. The outlawing of berserkers is, in a way, the story of a society redefining itself. No longer willing to indulge the wild rage, now eager to enforce restraint. Yet, outlawing did not erase memory. On the contrary, it may have sharpened it. Once berserkers were no longer a real nuisance. They became safer to remember as legend. Communities could tell stories of berserkers without having to deal with them in the hall the next morning. They became a kind of cultural monster, invoked for drama, but kept at arm's length. In this sense, berserkers occupy the same imaginative niche as dragons or giants. Once real enough to frighten, later tamed into storytelling fodder. Modern scholarship has tried to peel back the myth to find the historical core, but the task is slippery. Were berserkers a formal brotherhood, or just a label for particularly aggressive men? Did they truly use intoxicants, or is that a modern projection? Were they genuinely respected, or mostly mocked? The sources do not agree. Perhaps the best answer is that berserkers were never just one thing. They were a set of performances, behaviors, and reputations, woven into myth and remembered unevenly. Like the flicker of firelight on a shield, they shift depending on the angle from which you view them. Outside Scandinavia, the berserker myth proved portable. By the 19th century, it was not only Nordic nationalists but also Europeans more broadly who claimed berserkers as symbols. In Germany, for instance, scholars connected them to broader ideas of Teutonic warrior spirit. In Britain, writers folded them into the larger narrative of barbarian ancestors. Each group bent the berserker to its own use, stripping away the awkward parts and polishing the image to match its preferred story. The result was a figure more mythic than ever, but also less tethered to historical reality. In the 20th century, the berserker image filtered into fantasy literature and eventually into role-playing games and films. The figure of the warrior whose rage makes him unstoppable is now a stock character, appearing in contexts far removed from Viking halls. Few modern players of video games or tabletop paints pause to wonder about Amanita muscaria or Odin cults when they declare their character has gone into a berserker rage. The Old Norse image has been reduced to a mechanic. Rage equals power. And yet, even in this simplified form, the idea remains compelling. What lingers beneath the surface is the same question that puzzled saga writers. What does it mean to lose control? Is it liberation, or is it danger? The berserker legend gives us both answers at once. It promises freedom from fear and pain, but it warns of collapse and chaos. It glamorizes violence while quietly mocking it. Perhaps that is why the image endures, because it reflects our own mixed feelings about rage, power, and the fine line between courage and madness. As we drift into the closing reflections, the berserker stands revealed less as a historical oddity and more as a human archetype. The dream of unchained power, the fear of unchained violence, and the enduring fascination with those who dared to step across the line. Drifting closer to the present, the berserker's shadow lingers in surprising corners of culture, where medieval law codes tried to stamp out the berserk gore, and sagas painted them as both awe-inspiring and unruly. Modern imagination has rehabilitated them into something almost admirable. In fantasy novels and films, the berserker is often portrayed as the loyal companion, the unstoppable fighter who throws himself into danger while others hesitate. The awkward details, shield biting at feasts, collapsing in exhaustion, or harassing their neighbors, are conveniently forgotten. What survives is the spectacle of rage without consequence, distilled into entertainment. The mushroom theory, despite its thin evidence, has played an outsized role in keeping the berserker legend alive. Writers in the 20th century latched onto the image of warriors high on Amanita muscaria, stomping into battle with red and white hallucinations buzzing in their heads. It is the kind of theory that sticks because it feels narratively satisfying, even if historically weak. It offers a modern pharmacological explanation for ancient frenzy. Scholars have pointed out the obvious flaws. The mushroom's effects are inconsistent, often unpleasant, and hardly the recipe for military efficiency. Yet the myth endures, repeated in documentary, speculative histories, and late-night conversations over beer. In its own way, this obsession with mushrooms says more about modern taste for psychedelic explanations than about Viking practice. Other theories have their advocates too. Some suggest alcohol binges, others henbane or other intoxicants. A few scholars emphasize ritual performance, drumming, chanting, or controlled breathing techniques that could trigger altered states. This explanation feels closer to the sagas themselves, which describe frenzy as something summoned rather than swallowed. To work oneself into a trance through ritual would have carried both spiritual weight and practical utility, lending credibility to the idea that berserkers were less chemically altered than psychologically primed. Still, the fascination remains. The berserker is irresistible because he straddles boundaries. He is human and beast, sacred and profane, hero and menace. That liminality gives him flexibility across cultures. He can be celebrated as a fearless warrior or condemned as a dangerous brute, depending on what the storyteller needs. For nationalist movements in the 19th century, he was a symbol of ancestral strength. For Christian saga writers, he was a foil for moral heroes. For modern gamers, he is a class feature. Each retelling reshapes the figure while leaving the core unchanged. A man who loses himself in rage and becomes something more or less than human. The irony is that real berserkers, if they existed in the numbers the sagas suggest, were likely far less glamorous. They may have been mercenaries, outcasts, or small bands of violent young men with reputations larger than their actual skills. Communities may have tolerated them when war was at hand, but once peace returned, they became liabilities, the very qualities that made them useful. Recklessness, aggression, disdain for armor made them disruptive at home. Laws against berserker gang hint at the frustration of trying to fold such men back into orderly society. In this sense, the saga tradition might exaggerate, but it does not entirely lie. Berserkers were both admired and resented, celebrated and suppressed. Their afterlife in modern culture, by contrast, strips away that complexity. Few movie berserkers collapse in exhaustion after a rage, as the sagas insist they did. Few game characters suffer legal punishment for going berserk at the wrong time. Modern versions emphasize the glory without the consequences, perhaps because audiences prefer their violence tidy. Yet the saga's insistence on the aftermath, the vulnerability, the social disruption was not accidental. It reflected a society that knew both the allure and the danger of unrestrained fury. By remembering that collapse, the sagas offered a quiet, corrective rage. Is powerful, but it burns itself out. Even the language we use today carries traces of this ambivalence. To say someone went berserk can be comic, tragic, or frightening, depending on the context. A toddler going berserk in a candy aisle is amusing. A soldier going berserk on a battlefield is terrifying. A computer system going berserk is frustrating. The word shifts with ease, just as the figure did across centuries. That flexibility is the hallmark of a myth that still speaks to us, even when we no longer believe in Odin or shield-gnawing frenzies. Perhaps what lingers most is the fantasy of stepping outside ordinary limits. The berserker reminds us of the temptation to shed fear, hesitation, and even self-awareness in pursuit of pure action. It is a tempting vision, though most of us know it is unsustainable. The sagas themselves told us so. After the rage comes the collapse. Yet even knowing this, the image fascinates. We admire, we mock, we borrow, we refrain. The berserker endures, flickering in and out of history like a torch carried through shifting generations. And as we drift toward the end of their long story, the berserkers stand less as specific warriors and more as a human archetype. Our uneasy fascination with the possibility of becoming beast-like, powerful and free, only to find that every frenzy has its price. Sliding into the final reflections, the figure of the Viking berserker feels less like a historical puzzle to be solved, and more like a lantern flickering, shifting, casting different shapes depending on where you stand. The sagas gave us one version, warriors touched by Odin, raging with animal ferocity, collapsing once the storm passed. The laws gave us another disruptive men whose antics threatened peace to be fined, exiled, or banned. The romantics offered yet another noble savages, embodiments of primal northern vigor, and modern popular culture has reduced them to a kind of shorthand rage made flesh, ready to be summoned with a few dice rolls or a line of cinematic script. Each retelling adds a layer, but none captures the whole. If we strip the legend down to its core, what remains is the idea of men who stepped outside the ordinary boundaries of control. Whether through ritual intoxication or sheer adrenaline, they performed madness until it became real enough to terrify. Their rage was a weapon, not because it made them literally invulnerable, but because it bent the battlefield's psychology. They howled, they struck, they scared their enemies into hesitation, and when their frenzy ended, they paid the cost in exhaustion and vulnerability. The sagas did not omit that detail, perhaps because it offered a necessary reminder. No power is without its price. The fascination with Berserkers endures because it touches something deeply human. On one level, it is a fantasy of liberation, the dream of shedding fear, hesitation, even the burden of thought, and throwing oneself fully into action. Who would not, in some quiet corner of the mind, wish for that kind of freedom in a moment of crisis? But the other side of the fantasy is equally present. The fear of losing oneself, of becoming monstrous, of being consumed by the very rage one embraced. The Berserker is both dream and nightmare, inspiration and warning. The myths about mushrooms and intoxicants reflect our own attempts to explain that paradox. We want a neat trigger, something external to blame or credit. A mushroom, a seed, a potion. It is easier than accepting that human beings can, with enough ritual and belief, work themselves into states that look supernatural. To admit that is to admit that the line between control and chaos is thinner than we like to believe. The mushroom theory comforts us. By shifting the responsibility to chemistry, the sagas, with their blunt descriptions of frenzy and collapse, remind us that psychology alone can be just as dangerous. There is also irony in how the Berserker image softened as it traveled through time. For the Vikings, they were liminal figures, admired and feared, useful and disruptive. For the medieval church, they became villains, pagan remnants to be subdued. For romantic writers, they were heroic ancestors, glorious in their wildness. For modern pop culture, they are colorful archetypes, stripped of their messy contradictions. Each retelling smooths away some edges, leaving a version more suitable to its age. And yet, even in simplified form, the essence lingers. Rage as power, frenzy as identity. Language preserves this essence almost invisibly. To say a machine went berserk is to borrow from a 1,000-year-old performance of shield-biting fury. The toddler going berserk in a toy store is unknowingly reenacting a fragment of saga imagery. The word has drifted so far from its origin that most speakers never pause to think of Odin or Icelandic law codes. But the survival of the term itself is telling. Few other warrior archetypes have left such a direct trace in our everyday vocabulary. Berserkers may not have been invulnerable, but their myth certainly was. If we step back, the story of the Berserker is also the story of how societies manage violence. Every community admires courage, but fears recklessness. Every culture wants strong defenders, but dreads what happens when strength turns inward. Berserkers dramatized that tension, and the sagas used them to explore it. They gave listeners a safe way to think about the dangers of excess. Admire the frenzy, but remember the collapse. It is a lesson that still resonates, even if today it arrives through comic books rather than court poets. In the end, the Berserkers were probably never as invincible as the sagas claimed, nor as numerous as modern imagination suggests. They were likely a handful of men on the margins, their reputations inflated by fear, story, and repetition. But that handful left a legend far larger than their lives. They became symbols of humanity's ambivalence toward rage, of our attraction to extremes, and of our endless tendency to turn messy reality into neat myth. So when we hear the word berserk, whether in a saga translation or in the humdrum setting of a grocery store tantrum, we are brushing against that long lineage. Behind the word flickers the image of a man in a bear skin or with a bare chest, eyes wild, howling to Odin, biting his shield, terrifying his enemies, and then collapsing in the mud. Both ridiculous and sublime, both feared and mocked, both real and mythical, the berserker endures, not because of mushrooms or magic, but because he embodies something we recognize, the uneasy allure of losing control. May this story settle in your heart like a whisper, and may your dreams be calm and kind. Good night.